Education Scotland's guidelines for early reading are organised across three main areas. These are building a literacy-rich environment through interactions, experiences and spaces, developing skills for reading, and building independent and engaged readers. For each of the areas pictured, a suite of videos has been developed to support professional learning. The videos have been carefully developed to align with Scotland's Curriculum for Excellence guidance. Throughout the video, some technical terms are used to describe aspects of early reading. The QR code shown on the slide will allow you to access a glossary with brief explanations of some of the terms used. Each area has been broken down into 4 themes. There is a video which explores each theme, identifying key messages and research which supports the guidance. This video is focused on developing tools for reading, as underlined on the slide. You may choose to watch this video in isolation, but it is recommended that the overall suite of videos is used to support a broader programme of professional learning. Professional knowledge and expertise based on current research should be used to develop tools for reading. Within this video, we will explore the following 3 key messages. Teaching sight vocabulary, or common words, should be linked to the sounds and letter patterns of words. Context is crucial to support reading for understanding. However, for most children, decoding should be the first approach to word recognition. Schools should ensure the use of reading schemes and resources are matched to children's needs and complement their approach to teaching reading. A variety of approaches to teaching word reading may be recommended by different programmes, publishers and researchers. This variety can lead to uncertainty. For example, where recommended approaches don't align with our own experience of learning to read or teaching others. Research around the teaching of reading is constantly evolving as our understanding of brain development and learning to read develops. Over the course of this video, we will invite you to consider how current research relates to your professional knowledge, practice and expertise. This video will explore some approaches to word reading as outlined in the Curriculum for Excellence Tools for Reading Organiser. We will focus on sight vocabulary, context clues, and what recent evidence tells us are the most effective approaches to teaching word reading. We will then explore some of the research around the merits of different types of reading scheme and consider how they can be used to support reading progress. This key message explains that the teaching of sight vocabulary, or common words, should be linked to the sounds and letter patterns of words. Sight vocabulary or common words can have different meanings to different people and are often used interchangeably alongside terms such as tricky words, high-frequency words, irregular words, and common exception words. Some reading schemes may also have a selection of keywords to learn as sight vocabulary, for example, names of characters. The range of terms can lead to misunderstanding and confusion, and researchers admit there is no common definition for these. For the purpose of this video, we will define sight words as words that are instantly recognised and identified without conscious decoding or sounding out. At first, these might be words that are meaningful to young children. Often their name or print they see regularly in their environment, such as names of supermarkets or restaurants. Over time, many words that young children read by decoding eventually become sight words. That is, children learn to read them automatically through the orthographic mapping process. We will explore what this term means later in this video. Developing a sight vocabulary is important for fluency, a core component of becoming an independent reader, as explored in developing the 5 components of reading video. We will now go on to explore how children learn to read by sight and suggest ways you can support children to learn sight words or common words at the early stages of learning to read. Here are some of the common terms used. As already described, sight words, or sight vocabulary, are words that are instantly recognised and identified without conscious decoding or sounding out. Daniel Willingham describes this as reading at a glance. Common, or high-frequency words are a specific group that make up a high percentage of the words our learners will encounter in texts. This includes words like the, said, of, and have. They might also be referred to as dolch or phrase lists, as these two researchers compiled lists of words from the most common children's literature at the time, Dolch in the 1930s and Fry in the 1990s. While these lists still represent the majority of high-frequency words, it is important to remember that language changes over time and can be experienced differently across communities and households. One potential difficulty with using these lists to teach sight words is that they contain a mixture of words with simple sound letter correspondences and some more complex ones. Take, for example, the common words big and said. Beginning readers at the stage of learning the simple alphabetic code can more easily decode big, but are unlikely to have the knowledge to decode the complex sound letter correspondence of AI as in the word said. This is why words like said are sometimes referred to as tricky, irregular, or common exception words, because children haven't learned the code or letter sound correspondences for these words yet, and they usually have less frequently used letter sound correspondences. Although tricky words contain more complex letter sound correspondences than children have been taught, most of these words are likely to have parts of the simple code in their structure. For example, in the word said, s and d are not tricky. There are exceptions to these, for example the word I. An important distinction to make is the difference between teaching of sight words from the process of reading by sight or reading without conscious decoding. It is estimated that as adult readers we can have a sight vocabulary of anything between 30,000 to 70,000 words, but we didn't learn this number of words by remembering their shape or outline. The term reading by sight or reading without conscious decoding is a mental process referred to by Airy as orthographic mapping. The term orthographic refers to how words are spelled. The mapping or storage in the brain of how words are spelled is a mental process we use to take an unfamiliar printed word and turn it into an immediately recognisable word. As shown on the slide, during the mapping process, the letters we see with our eyes and the sounds we hear in that word are processed and stored together as a sight word. A common misconception is that this is the same as memorising the way a word looks. However, the brain does not store words as images. Dehaney states that neuroimaging and eye-tracking research has demonstrated that skilled readers process every single letter of the printed word from left to right and in parallel. Our brains do not look at the whole word shape. It can take each letter string apart in a word and then stores it as a sight word. The images on this slide from the Implementing Phonic Approaches video reminds us that phonics instruction involves developing a child's phonemic awareness and teaching the relationships between the individual sounds of spoken language and the letters of written language. It teaches children to use these relationships to read and write words. Once early learners have acquired a reasonable knowledge of letter sound correspondences and are using this to segment and blend words, they develop a store of words that they can read effortlessly. They then begin to transfer this knowledge of known words to help decode unknown words. Scher explains the idea that each time a reader is exposed to a new word when reading, they are able to use their phonic knowledge and skills of decoding to work out how to say the word and add it to their orthographic memory. At first, this is a slow process. However, each successful decoding of a new word gives the reader exposure to letter patterns and information that is the foundation of skilled and instant word recognition. This process is underpinned by good oral language skills and knowledge of how speech sounds map to letters. Explored in the videos, the importance of oral language for reading and implementing phonic approaches. Kilpatrick states that typically, after 1 to 4 exposures of decoding a written word, it becomes stored in our brains and is instantly familiar. However, some learners may need multiple opportunities to decode for a word to be recognised rapidly. Children with specific difficulties in decoding may require different approaches to learning sight vocabulary. Strategies to support this can be found in the Addressing Dyslexia Toolkit Reading Circles resource. Many common or high-frequency words contain more complex letter-sound correspondences than children at the early stages of reading have been taught. There would seem to be a case for teaching children a small number of words which they are likely to see very frequently in the text they are reading. Shapiro and Solity research indicates that teaching a small number of sight words does not interfere with phonics learning. They found that children with low initial phonological awareness made more progress with reading when phonics and some sight words were taught together. Teaching sight words can be mistakenly viewed as getting in the way of children's phonic knowledge, particularly if it is taken to mean memorising words by their shape, as previously mentioned. Castles, Russell and Nation conclude that successful methods for teaching sight words are likely to involve engaging children in a detailed study of the letters in the word and their sequence, with a focus on the difficult parts, and linking this with the word's pronunciation. We'll look at some examples of this approach in the next few slides. An example of explicitly teaching sight words is when an educator might say, "Here is the word of." Let's say the sounds in of, v. The educator writes the letters as children say those sounds. The educator might ask, "What is the tricky part of this word?" F says v. You might underline it or circle it to emphasise the tricky part of the word, which doesn't sound the way it looks or isn't familiar to them. Another example might be while reading text, a child might sound out the word was, s, and say was. The educator might respond, "Was looks like was, but we don't say was, we say was." The tricky bit in this word is as says oz. This is where pronunciation comes into play. Multiple studies have shown that children are used to making adjustments to pronunciation when they read regular words. For example, in the word different, which has simple sound letter correspondences, we drop the middle sound to match the pronunciation. Different to different. Another example is the word person, which has simple sound letter correspondences, but we change the o sound to an I to match the pronunciation, person to person. In the same way, children over time learn the letter strings in tricky words and make adjustments to the pronunciation of these words. Another useful approach, advocated by both Louisa Moats and Timothy Shanahan, is to group common words which have consistent patterns, such as he, be, she, we, or so, go, no. This supports children's capacity to be sensitive to and search for patterns in words. Shanahan has a useful literacy blog which has lots of practical advice for teachers on all aspects of teaching reading. According to Mark Seidenberg, children who struggle to notice and remember patterns of letters and words find word recognition more challenging. So by providing explicit teaching that draws attention to similar patterns in letter sound correspondences, we can increase awareness of the letter patterns in the English language. As children gain experience with reading and writing words, their attention can be drawn to other letter patterns in words. For example, prefixes like un, and suffixes like ing, ed, or s. As their orthographic memory develops, we can support children to notice other common chunks of letter patterns, such as ick, ok, ache, through wordplay, stories, rhymes, and songs. Shanahan advises to avoid teaching sight words as lists, as he observes that recognising words in a list is a very different task than reading them within the context of sentences. Pamela Snow also makes the point that cognitive load should be taken into consideration for children in the early stages of learning to read, and to avoid overwhelming a beginning reader with lists of unrelated sight words to learn by rote. Limiting the number of common or sight words learned in line with text they are reading is an important factor. Motes reminds us that we tend to remember something that makes sense to us. So teaching sight vocabulary or common words linked to the sounds and letter patterns of words will support learners' recall. It is also important to provide opportunities for children to regularly review and practice these in connected reading and writing experiences. This key message emphasises that context is crucial to support reading for understanding. However, for most children, decoding should be the first approach to word recognition. As outlined in the Curriculum for Excellence Literacy in English, Tools for Reading Experiences and Outcomes, knowledge of sight vocabulary, phonics, context clues, punctuation and grammar all support reading with understanding and expression. This next section of the video will focus on the use of context clues to support reading for understanding. Let's begin by exploring what we mean by context clues and when they might be used by a reader. Readers use context clues to support or confirm their understanding of a text. A reader may use clues such as vocabulary in the text or background knowledge to confirm their word recognition. For example, a child may decode the word umbrella and use their knowledge and experience of and vocabulary associated with rainy days to confirm their reading of the word. Context clues could also take the form of illustrations or the punctuation or grammar of a sentence. Context clues are particularly helpful where children can already decode the word but need to use context to confirm the meaning. This is particularly important for words which can be used in a variety of ways. Take, for example, the word match, as shown on the slide. In this example, a child would need to use their background knowledge, illustrations, or other vocabulary in the text to decide whether the match referred to in the text is the type we use to light a fire, a competition like a sporting match, or match as in two things which look alike. Context can also support a child as they decide how to pronounce a word, where there are alternative pronunciations depending on the meaning. For example, words such as wind and wind, or read and read. We know that context clues such as vocabulary, prior knowledge, and sentence structure all support reading for understanding. Research by the National Reading Panel, referred to throughout this resource, found that the systematic teaching of phonics should be the first approach used by teachers in developing the vital component of decoding. Put simply, context clues will support and confirm a reader's understanding of a text. However, decoding is the recommended approach which educators should support children to adopt when reading an unfamiliar word. Both of these elements combine together to develop children's recognition and understanding of words. There are some children, however, who will more heavily rely on context clues due to persistent difficulties in decoding. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to learning to read. Although decoding should be our first approach, it is not the only one. Further strategies can be found in the Addressing Dyslexia Toolkit. This key message reminds us that schools should ensure use of reading schemes and resources are matched to children's needs and complement their approach to teaching reading. Over the next few slides, we will explore some of the research around the merits of different reading texts and consider how these can be matched to children's needs to support reading progress. To begin, it's helpful to be aware of three main types of class reader. Shanahan provides some useful descriptions of predictable, controlled vocabulary and decodable readers, providing his evaluation of their potential advantages and disadvantages. Firstly, predictable texts. Predictable texts tend to focus on the meaning of words. Shanahan observed that they start with more natural-sounding language right out of the gate. However, by their nature, they may also rely on the reader using repetition, context, and pictures to guess at words. Predictable texts can be seen as problematic, as they lead children to read the pictures instead of the words, which means they are relying mainly on the context. Controlled vocabulary texts initially contain a small number of words that are used repeatedly. New words are introduced over time, and children learn to memorise them through practice. As the text is initially restricted to a small number of words, the language does not begin to flow more naturally until children are able to recognise more words. Controlled vocabulary readers may be seen as problematic, as they tend to steer children towards guessing at unknown words memorised from previous texts. Decodable readers are the third type. They are described by 5 from 5 as simple texts which contain the specific letter-sound correspondences that beginning readers have been taught. They encourage children to sound out words using decoding strategies rather than guessing from pictures or other clues. However, Shanahan highlights that decodable texts can be seen as problematic as they tend to steer children away from meaning, and at times even away from real words. Research evidence can go some way to supporting decisions around how to use different types of reading books, though this is an area in which the evidence is still evolving. Birch et al. Carried out a literature review into the use of different texts for reading instruction and found that research lacked robust evidence, with definitions and terms used interchangeably in different articles. A number of literacy professionals have also noted a lack of evidence and conflicting research in this area. Christopher Such suggests that given the current lack of clarity provided by direct comparisons between children learning with decodable texts and those learning without, it makes sense to consider the justification for their use. In other words, it is not yet clear that predictable and controlled vocabulary texts are necessarily unhelpful in supporting young children as they are learning to read. Nor is it clear that decodable readers are essential. However, as research continues to evolve, we can use some insights, particularly about decodable readers, to inform our practice. In terms of choosing readers for young children in the early stages of learning to read, decodable readers offer a number of advantages. Castles, Russell and Nation suggest there is a good argument for using decodable readers in the very early stages of reading instruction. However, they note that beyond these initial stages of reading, the case for decodable books weakens as the benefits of decodable readers are likely to be outweighed by their limitations. Nevertheless, as children build phonic knowledge, decodable readers allow children the opportunity to practice letter-sound correspondences and quickly build their confidence and ability to read connected text. Early practice with this type of reading book allows children to develop the habit of using knowledge of letter-sound relationships as the first strategy for reading unfamiliar words, described by 5 from 5 as setting the reading reflex. Decodable readers are seen to enable children to sound out rather than guess unknown words, develop this reflex, and lead to more successful independent reading. Within his guide, Such helpfully suggests that as children develop confidence and skills, we can start to prepare them for the realities of reading by supporting their transition to more complex reading texts. We can gradually remove decodable text as scaffolds, which children no longer need as they become more proficient readers. It is important to remember that the pathway shown in the slide may look different for some children as we tailor our use of decodable text to meet their changing needs. Some children may be able to move through the pathway more quickly, whilst others may need longer to consolidate their skills using decodable texts. What do we need to be aware of when choosing decodable texts? Decodable books may have a more restricted word choice due to the need to focus on the letter-sound correspondences that children have been taught. This has led to criticisms that they can be quite contrived and lack a storyline, making them less enjoyable to read. We should therefore consider whether the text makes sense as stories, are engaging for the reader, and build their knowledge. Decodable text must also match the phonic programme in use. Noers emphasises that children need to have been taught all of the code they need in order to read the text. Some questions to consider. Do the texts provide consistent patterns of phonics which children are familiar with? Do they provide opportunities for children to apply their learning from phonics teaching? Noers also states that new code should not be introduced via a decodable text, as these are for applying learning from phonics teaching, therefore consolidating knowledge. Her advice is that children should ideally be given texts that lag at least a little behind what they have been taught, and you should be confident that your learners are comfortable with their new knowledge before they are asked to independently read a text that includes it. This quote from Snow emphasises that alongside any decodable reading texts, children should experience a wide range of high-quality texts through shared reading with adults. These books can be used to further develop the themes or stories from decodable texts. This expands the focus from sounding out practice to rich conversations about the stories with children, emphasising that reading is also about meaning. As covered elsewhere in these resources, the wider literacy environment is key. In the Supporting Children to Develop a Love of Reading video, we heard that by choosing relevant texts, young readers have the opportunity to access texts which reflect their lives, as well as introducing them to new ideas or worlds. To extend their range of reading, children need to choose, experience, and talk about new and different texts, authors, and illustrators. To sum up, a key finding of the literature review by Birch et al. Mentioned earlier was that the use of reading books for beginning readers is impacted by how they are used by the educator. Teaching reading is complex, so the expertise and judgment of the educator are just as important as the model, approach, or text. It is imperative for teachers to make thoughtful decisions about which text to use, when, and for what purposes. A video overview, glossary, signposted resources, and some reflective questions have been created to accompany this video. You can use the QR code on the screen to access these.